name's Richard Snyder. I'm a professor of political science here at Brown University. And it's a pleasure to have two friends and colleagues with us today, David Altman and Rossana Castiglioni. You could probably tell which was which, but I wasn't sure. And they're going to speak to us today about democracies under stress, drawing on evidence from Chile. Let me quickly introduce them. And by the way, the talk obviously is organized by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CLACS, here at Brown University. And I don't remember which other units were involved in co-sponsoring, but certainly the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs. So David Altman is professor of political science at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, the Catholic University of Chile, which is a partner institute of Brown University and also of the Watson Institute. He specializes in comparative politics, and I guess you could call him a democrologist. He studies democracy. His research and teaching is on democracy, the quality of democracy, institutions of democracy, and especially innovative forms of democratic practice, especially mechanisms of direct democracy. He's currently working on the political consequences of citizen participation in referenda and other popular initiatives. He's the author of the book Direct Democracy Worldwide, and is also the author of a forthcoming book entitled Citizenship and Contemporary Direct Democracy. David, even though he teaches and works in Chile, he's not Chilean, he's from Uruguay. So he is also an associate researcher at the Uruguayan National Agency for Research and Innovation, and he's twice received the Uruguayan National Prize of Political Science. If he were Chilean and had received the Uruguayan National Prize of Political Science twice, that would probably need some explaining. David has been a visiting scholar at a number of places, including the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the University of Texas at Austin, and this semester he is visiting at Harvard's Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, where he's the Lukšić visiting scholar. Rossana Castiglioni is an associate professor of political science at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago, Chile. She also specializes in the subfield of comparative politics, especially working on comparative social policy, issues of the quality of democracy, and more broadly Latin American comparative politics. Her work has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals such as Electoral Studies, Latin American Politics and Society, and the Canadian Journal of Political Science. She's the author of the book, The Politics of Social Policy Change in Chile and Uruguay. Rossana has been a visiting scholar at Leiden University in the Netherlands, at the Kellogg Institute at Notre Dame, University of Madison, Wisconsin, Oxford University, and she's currently visiting at Harvard University's Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, where she is the Cisneros visiting scholar. So we have with us today two distinguished experts on challenges of democracy in Latin America. They work and live in Chile, where they've been for at least a decade, if not more. More. Okay. And they're here to talk to us today to share their joint perspectives and wisdom on democratic representation under stress. Welcome to Brown, Rossana and David. Great to have you both here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the generous presentation, and thank you to CLACS and the Watson Institute for inviting us, for having us here. It's an honor to be in the University of Brown. So this is what we are going to do. We are going to try to persuade you that democratic representation is increasingly under stress in Chile. For those of you familiar with Latin American politics, after what's going on in Brazil, our talk is going to be absolutely irrelevant, probably. But we will try to persuade you that even in one of the most established democracies of the continent, there are signs of preoccupation. growing signs of preoccupation in terms of representation. So I'm going to try to focus on a general diagnosis of the problem, and then David is going to focus particularly in the problems related to institutions and elections, and offer some solutions, perhaps. Or, well, I don't know. I trust you. I trust you so much. Okay. In the past few years, there has been this idea that Chilean democracy is a solid democracy. This is the poster boy for good behavior, some said. So if this is just one indicator of the quality of democracy taken from the VDEM database, but if you see, Chile has been generally above above other Latin American countries in terms of democratic performance. If you look at economic performance, the story is the same. Chile is doing pretty well. Economic growth has been consistently above other Latin American countries. And the interesting thing is that Chile has been able to reduce poverty while promoting growth, which is something that not all countries have managed to do, and even to decrease extreme poverty. So because of a combination of virtuous, this virtuous performance in terms of democracy and in terms of economics, some have argued that Chile is a sort of model country in the Latin American context. And this is taken in the press, but also many scholars have argued that the case of Chile is one of the solid cases of democratic performance and economic performance. Yet, despite this sort of Chilean miracle and this sort of model country, democracy seems to be under stress. Here, I am not discussing the definition of democratic representation I am working with. You can have it here, but I just want to emphasize that I'm going to go through a few indicators that Manwaring et al. Have discussed. We'll talk a little bit about identification with parties and coalitions, trust in government and parties, protest, and electoral participation. Let's go for the voters' identification of trust. If you take any public opinion poll in Chile, any of them, you will see that the largest political party is none. When Chileans are asked, what party do you identify with, what coalition do you identify with, most of them will say, I don't identify with any party, with any coalition. And that's about 80%. If you ask about trust in parties, trust in government, as you can see, the picture is alarming. Now, Chileans are turning to protest. They are not voting, as we will see in a few moments, and they are taking to the streets. And this is going on in several policy areas, in the environment, in pensions, education, and in different areas, citizens are taking the streets to make clear they don't like the way things are. There are not systematic measures of protest in Chile that we can really trust, but Nicolás Soma from the sociology department of the Católica University has been working on that. And what he shows is that from 2000 to 2012, the tendency has been to an increase in the number of protests. Now, this is, I think, the most alarming thing. Right after transition, electoral participation in Chile was around 80%. But in the last elections, less than 50% of the Chilean population voted in the elections. And if you see, there is a tendency of, with each election, less electoral participation. Now, apparently, now we have reached a meseta. I don't know how to say that. A plateau, but electoral participation has been going down. Now, when I say this generally in other countries, we have electoral participation has been decreasing. you have someone always saying, well, but this is going on in every country. And this is not entirely true. If you look at electoral participation in Latin America, what you will see is that in most countries in the last 25 years, electoral participation has either increased a little bit or maintained. There are a few exceptions, but in general, that has been the picture. And the two exceptions in the last 25 years are Costa Rica and Chile. In Chile, we had a 35% drop in electoral participation, and according to UNDP, that did a study of electoral participation in the world, Chile has the second largest drop of electoral participation worldwide, only surpassed by Madagascar. So this is huge. This is huge. It's a problem, I mean, the drop in electoral participation. So with my colleague Cristóbal Rovira from Universidad Diego Portales, we have been trying to figure out why this is going on, why there are increasing challenges to democratic representation. And what we have been doing is to stress three main explanations. One that is related to institutional design or to institutions, another that has to do with societal changes related to the emergence of what we call, well, what Pipa Norris calls critical citizens, but also changes in the structure of middle classes, and then a process of repoliticization of inequalities. I'm going to go through each of those. I'm going to go very quickly with the institutional design because David is going to cover that. But what we basically found is that there are a series of electoral and other institutional rules, formal and informal, that set a very rigid environment. What we mean is that institutions in Chile are really difficult to change. So this is a problem, as we will see later, because if you have angry citizens that are demanding changes and you have an institutional structure that makes things very sticky and very difficult to change, there is not a very virtuous combination. What are these institutions? Basically, on the first hand, the so-called binomial electoral system that Chile had for many years. David is going to explain that part. Second, a constitutional framework that established, and there are several problems with the constitutional framework. One has to do with the original sin. This is a constitutional framework that was created by a dictator, and that is very, very difficult to change. But also, the Constitution established special majorities and supermajorities to change some critical aspects of institutions. So the bar to establish structural changes in Chile is relatively high. Another problem is related to informal institutions, these institutions that are not written in paper, that make or empower some actors, particularly actors who hold the power, and make it less difficult or much more difficult to actors that are not part of the government to have an impact on policy making. And this is also related to what some authors have called democracia de los acuerdos, the idea that everything has to be agreed upon in order to be able to promote changes in Chile. So this makes things very difficult. And then the other thing is the autonomy that some institutions in charge of policy making, particularly economic policy making, have in Chile. There is, for example, a very small office. This is only an example. There is a small office in the Ministry of Economics called La Dirección de Presupuesto, the Direction of Budget, that has an incredible amount of power in determining which social programs can be or cannot be implemented. Nobody selected these guys. These are technical guys who are in charge of very important decisions. And it's something that is puzzling for those of us who study comparative social policy, is that you can meet with presidents that tell you the direction of budget did not allow me to promote this or that change. In other countries, if the president cannot do whatever he or she wants, these guys, the bureaucrats, are kicked off. Here you have these insulated bureaucrats telling the president that some programs cannot be changed. So they control and concentrate an extremely marked amount of power and make changes very difficult to occur. The other change that is important has to do with the emergence of critical citizens and changes in middle sectors. Critical citizens, as defined by Pippa Norris, are unsatisfied Democrats. They believe in democracy, they support democracy, but they are not happy with the way democracy works in their own countries. Now, when this satisfaction with democracy and support of democracy, there is a huge gap between the two. This is what she called democratic deficit. This gap has increased a lot in Chile, as I will show you in a while. And simultaneously, in Chile, there has been an expansion of middle-income sectors. This is good news. As many people left poverty, the middle sectors increase. But these very heterogeneous middle classes are extremely precarized. They are highly indebted, and they are very susceptible to suffer from any change that affects the economy or even other areas. So this obviously establishes enormous challenges to democratic representation. Let me show you a few figures. This is information from our public opinion poll, the Universidad Diego Portales public opinion poll on satisfaction and support with democracy. When you ask Chileans in 2010 about the support of democracy, you repeat the question 2013, 2015, you will see that more or less the data is stable, 56% to 51% of support for democracy. But then, when you ask about satisfaction or dissatisfaction with democracy, things changed dramatically in just 5 years. In 2010, 23% of those who answered our public opinion poll said they were not satisfied or not that much satisfied with democracy. In 5 years, this increased to 78%. 78%. So Chileans are increasingly dissatisfied with the way democracy works in their country. And at the same time, there has been an increasing repoliticization of inequality. This is a very interesting process because if you read about Chile in the 1990s, what you will see is that most scholars talk about the demobilization and depoliticization of Chileans. And this is all over the place. I mean, any text you find of the 1990s will talk about that. But something changed. Something changed, and in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, Chileans started to mobilize. Perceptions and discourses on inequality became much more salient. And these discourses and this uneasiness with inequality initially was related to income and education, but then it became relevant in other policy areas too. And more recently, there is an emphasis on gender, on ethnicity, and territorial gaps. So this is an important part of the political debate nowadays. New actors have emerged that try to take into these new issues, these emerging issues, but the way in which citizens try to make evident that they are not happy with the current state of affairs is through protest. This is interesting because sometimes when you say, well, you know what, Chileans are not happy about distribution of income or inequality in their country, everyone will say, well, this is going on in every country. This is true, but or in any Latin American country. But this is from Latinobarometro. If you compare Chileans' perception on inequality to any other country, you will see that for Chileans, distribution of income is extremely unequal. They have the sensation in every public opinion poll it appeared that inequality is a big problem in the country. So to summarize, what is the diagnosis we have made with my colleague Cristobal Rovira? There is an increase on these critical citizens. We have more critical citizens now than before. And these emerging precarious middle sectors are pushing the system for new or better benefits. The problem is, well, and this also leads to a repoliticization of inequalities and high levels of mobilization through protest. The problem is that these protesters find as a sort of fence institutions that are rigid, that are very difficult to change, even though the government, the recent government, the last government of Michelle Bachelet, announced and pursued a reform agenda. Now, the problem is that, and this is what some authors said, like Jana Morgan, that when you introduce reforms in a context of crisis, this might not have the expected result, might produce more mobilizations, more protests, more uneasiness in the part of citizens. So the result of the combination of these three elements, critical citizens, repoliticization of inequalities, and institutional rigidity, has produced these increasing challenges to democratic representation. So now I will leave the floor to David so he can present the rest of the depressing picture.
Very much. Okay. Okay, let me just 1 second. Well, thank you very much. Well, I'll try to follow Rossana's in the diagnosis of Chile, and somehow, yeah, I completely agree, and we were talking about this today in the morning and these last few days, that when we think about Chilean problems of today, but we realize what's going on in other big and major countries of Latin America, particularly Brazil and somehow Argentina, we somehow realize that Chilean problems are details in the way that democracy works, at least in its impact in the whole region. But I'm going to concentrate basically on some of the reformist agendas that President Bachelet pursued during her last administration that lasts until the beginning of this year, particularly electoral reform, which is one of the mothers of all the problems in Chilean transition to democracy. So basically what I want to say is that we have wasted a magnificent, a unique opportunity of mitigate certain challenges, certain chronic disease and conditions that Chile has since immemorial times, we can say. Because we succeed in approving a very broad a reformist agenda in Chile, but probably when we start to unpack what this reform would mean, we realize that maybe it's not the best of the reforms, the path that we should have taken. Okay, one of the major problems of Chile since transition to democracy until these last couple of years has been the binomial electoral system, which is a very particular and unique electoral system in which the country was divided in 60 districts of 2 people, 2 legislators, so there were 120 members in Congress. I'm talking about deputies chamber. This electoral system is not that particularly unrepresentative if we compare it with British majoritarian system or any other majoritarian system, but from the Chilean perspective, and given that until 1973 Chile had some sort of proportional representation, it meant a huge change in the way that Chileans related with the representatives. And one of the, beyond this original scene that Rossana was talking about, because it was drafted during the dictatorship government of Pinochet, one of the major points, or the weakest point, is that they say it was extremely underrepresentative. And for some people, it was a subsidy for the right. For other people, it was a subsidy for the Concertación, the center-left coalition of Chile. But as we can see, basically, the subsidies had been remained constant since the first democratic election of 1989 until the last election of 2013 under this system. We can see that the ones that are always punished are the third forces in Chile. the Communist Party or regional parties, but the center-right or the center-left, they have on average basically exactly the same subsidy of seats in Congress. So, of course, this was unfair from the perspective of some people, but somehow it produced a lot of effects beyond representation itself. Given that in each district you have two legislators, one is going to be for the majority and one, unless there is the first one doubles the number of votes than the second that comes in the list, that party or coalition is going to receive both of the members. Otherwise, it's going to be 1 and 1, right? So this produced that it was extremely easy in Chile to know who's going to get elected, because if you had enough votes to overcome the 33% of the vote in your district, you are for sure receiving at least one legislator. So, as Rossana, these pictures represent basically the participation in elections since 1988 until the last election, and they are divided in presidential elections and the rest of different elections. And we see that basically the pattern is identical. Decline is stepped, it's huge, statistically significant, and there is no way how to stop it. Looking at these graphs, political elites decide to change some little details of the institutional architecture of the country, and they start with compulsory vote. As you know, Chile until 2009 had probably one of the most perverse electoral systems in the way that citizens need to inscribe in electoral registries and then to vote. Because up to that time, Chileans had the right to decide whether they become electors. But if they decide so, it becomes an obligation to vote, to participate in the election. It's one of the very few countries that had that in the world. Many countries, you have voluntary registration in the electoral books, and then you decide whether you go participate or not. Here, you had the choice whether you go to register yourself, but then if you decide so, you had to vote. Otherwise, you're going to be punished by the state. So they decide to change. This was the constitutional reform was approved in 2009 during the last year of Bachelet administration, the first Bachelet administration, and then it was institutionalized during the first couple of years of first Piñera government. Another thing that makes quite interesting, it's old pictures, but it remains exactly the same until the last election, is how segmented participation is in Chile. As you can see in the figure upwards, it's the declared electoral participation based on age. So we have the first, we have 18, 25, 26, 35, etc., etc. Obviously, this electoral system of Chile made, as everywhere we can say, the older you were, the more likely you were to participate. The young people, the young generations didn't participate, which also translated, obviously, in ideological biases that electors had. As you know, the older we are, usually we tend to become a little bit more conservative. This happens everywhere. So we had a terrible combination of old electors, quite conservative, and that's one of the reasons how we can explain that policy in Chile was extremely conservative, extremely against any sort of change, particularly in post-material values like abortion, divorce, or things like that. But this hides a real interesting fact that despite the fact that Chilean was kind of frozen, you know, when you see the macro figures in Chile, you see when you study volatility in little elections or dividing the districts or circumscription, even at the municipal level, volatility turns to be extremely high, like almost 40 or even 50% of volatility, which is huge. So all this scenario make the Chilean party system somehow, as I call it with a colleague of mine, Juan Pablo Luna, who was here also fellow, uprooted but stable party system. Under this scenario, we have a magnificent opportunity with the last administration of Bachelet that she won with huge majorities due to all these demonstrations that Rossana showed the pictures. Thousands of people cutting the main avenues of Santiago, paralyzing the whole state. So there was a momentum for change. And this is what we have. We have an administration, the latest Bachelet administration, that embraced huge amount of reforms, educational reform, taxation, electoral, labor, and even constitutional. Not all of these reforms were successful, at least 100% from the perspective of the government, but they advanced, they move, as Bachelet said, they move the fence 2 steps forwards. So now we are seeing a different country. Paradoxically, as I put here, all these reforms were dealt in the context of a political system accused by the same authorities of being unable to process substantial reforms. So a system that was considered very statu quo oriented processed all these reforms because they say that it was unable to process reform. So it's kind of weird, Chile, from every dimension and from every angle you want to see it. So as I mentioned, this is a very simple graph of electoral districts in Chile. We have every district was the same, 2 members each, 60 districts. That was Chile up to the last reform. The new electoral system in Chile that was approved in 2015 consists of 28 districts that oscillates between 3 and 8 members each, open list, and you have to select only 1 member. So each political party can present up to n+1. If the district has 5 members, you can present up to 6 candidates for that district. And you, citizen, have only 1 vote, only 1 human being you select from the list. So now we have 155 members in Congress, in the lower chamber, deputies, instead of having used a different, more sensate distribution of consolidating different districts to make the district larger, to make them a little bit more proportional. Another thing that happened in Chile with this reform is that it increased segmentations instead of integration. You know, we have, let's say that we are divided between yellows and blacks, and these are the typical districts. So if we join 2 districts, in this way, we're gonna be speaking in this new district, 82% yellow, 18% black, just to give you a graphic idea. And in this one, it's gonna be 77 black and 23 yellow. But in Chile, instead of this is the way that the Chilean government did, the Chilean reform approved the reform instead of doing this. So now, districts that were extremely rich districts, they were joined together instead, and that's another missing opportunity of combining and integrating different type of societies within the same districts. They combine them in a way that still the country is extremely segmented. Now, this is a kind of hard table to read, but it's not that difficult. We had 60 districts, okay? So for instance, District 57 and 58 in the region of the Los Lagos were joined together to make a new district that now is the 27. What I calculated here, it's about the strength, the political strength that each district had and now it has with the new reform. As we can see, there is a bunch of those, obviously, that some districts win power, political power, some districts lose political power. The red ones are those who have negative power, so they lose relative political power in Congress. And I wanted to know which are these. Do they have some characteristic in common? So my intuition is that yes, they have some characteristic in common. So the losers are some particular groups in Chile. And who are the losers? Well, I ran a simple model with all the districts, and I took into account the degree of poverty, whether they were from the capital city, the distance to the capital city, the distance squared, because my intuition was that those in the middle, not extremes, Not those close to Antarctica, not close to Bolivia and Peru, but those in the middle are the losers of this game, and the size of the population. What we see is that there are extremely significant coefficients here. And who are those districts? The poorest. And the Mapuche districts. Who are the losers of this new reform? The poor people and the Mapuche regions of Chile, which are, by the way, together. There is a huge correlation between poverty and ethnic minority in Chile in terms of the power and the relative power that they have in Congress, right? Now, there is, we keep with bad news. One of the aspects and one of the reasons to make a huge electoral reform in Chile was to make the system more representative and more proportional. Now, the system today is, yes, indeed, it's easier to get into Congress, but it's much less proportional than it was before, even at the worst moment of the binominalism, which was accused of being the least proportional of every electoral system in the world, at least some people say that. So using this very famous index of proportionality, it's clear that today, after the elections, the last elections, today the electoral system is less proportional than it was before in Chile. So we are almost there. Here it's one of the...
Can I ask just one?
Yes.
Can you back 1 second?
Yeah, sure.
And was it 2015 that the electoral reform happened?
Yes. The reform was exactly here,
Yeah.
right? So this is the first election with the new system.
Thanks.
So another aspect that was always underlined by those critics of the old electoral system, like myself and many others, it was that many legislators were dragged by the whole architecture of binomial system because they had an ally of them in the same district that pushed them upwards and got them in Congress. Why? Because there was a very important politician in that district that had a lot of votes, and I was his fellow in the list, so I was dragged by him to get into Congress because together we duplicate the votes of the second list. In 2013, there were 11 legislators that were dragged, and that represent about 9% of the chamber. Today, with the new electoral system, there were 29 out of 155, and they represent 18% of the chamber. So 18% of the chamber are people today that were dragged by the fellow and strong politicians, colleagues in the same party slot. So this represents about more than 100% increase, and fragmentation also increased, obviously, from 2.7 effective legislative coalitions to 3.1. Here it's Florcita Motuda. This is one of the new elected legislators in Chile, maybe one of the most pictoresco, I don't know how to say, something like that. Exotic. And I'm quoting him. I got elected, but I would have liked to be elected with votes, the electoral law. And he said that. He took this tweet out very fast. It was there in the cyberspace for a couple of days. But then when everyone took this tweet, he took it away. But that's one of the effects of the new electoral system. So now, we have open list proportional representation with the possibility for parties or coalitions to present M+1, M is the magnitude of district, as candidates for the legislative election. And this, in my opinion, is increasing the personalist vote, las Florcita Motuda, this guy. It opens the system very much for political outsiders. And due to the whole electoral law, it's basing politics into the local topics instead of national topics. And therefore, all these three erodes political parties' collective action, discipline, and programmatic coherence. Potential improvements. Well, as happens everywhere here in the United States or any other democracy, participation is very open to class bias or different types of class bias. So mandatory vote today, it's discussed in Chile. Mandatory vote, I'm saying between quote unquote, because technically speaking, there is not such a thing as a mandatory vote in a democracy, right? What we have is mandatory presence of one person in one place to sign a book, say, hi, I'm here, but you don't have to vote. You can vote blank, you can nil your vote, you can choose by lot which candidate you vote. I mean, you don't have to vote technically, so you are not, you don't have a mandate to vote, so it's compulsory presence of citizens, so it's a technicality, but it's interesting to say. So I would say the mandatory vote, or what we mentioned as mandatory vote, it's a good way, and several political parties, particularly the Christian Democrats and some large factions of the Socialist Party are, again, thinking seriously on going back to mandatory vote. Obviously, it's not very popular, but close and block list would have helped a lot. It's extremely unlikely because I was in one of these presidential committees that President Bachelet did during her first administration. I remember I proposed closed list like in Spain, Uruguay, and many other places, and I was accused of being anti-democrat. So I don't think, and that was the concertación. Imagine what would have happened if there were people from the Alianza there. And another possibility is to offer citizens the M quantity of votes, so we don't have florcitas mortudas anymore, at least if we are thinking in the Chilean perspective, and somehow new institutions which are sought to make a higher synchronization between political elites and the sovereign, which are citizen initiative mechanisms of direct democracy based on popular initiatives and referendums, which are extremely popular, at least at the youngest cohorts of the Chilean electorate these days. They are demanding direct votes for accepting or rejecting the educational reform or the pension reforms. There are a lot of demands to move towards this, but of course, these new institutions, but of course, the political elites are quite reluctant to open the door for these risky institutions. So, again, to finish, why I say that? Well, I hope I have explained that, but we have squandered a unique opportunity to mitigate certain chronic conditions in Chile through crucial institutional reform. And I think I stop here, and thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rossana, David.
Welcome.
I'm going to moderate the discussion, Q&A. So why don't we take, if we have them, 2 or 3 questions, and if you want, you can direct your question toward one, both, or both of the speakers, and then we'll give them a chance to reply. John Tomasi, colleague from political science, and say who you are, please. It's good to know who's in the room.
John Tomasi, colleague.
If I don't say who you are.
My question is for both of you. It's a kind of particular question. But I'm interested in Frente Amplia, the broad front. And so for David, you said that the electoral reforms, the losers are the poor. I gather that Frente Amplio speaks for the poor. Maybe not, but I'm interested if that might be true. But more interested, how did it happen? How did they took 22, I think 22 seats? Or is it 22? Yeah, 20 deputies. Sanchez got 22% of the electoral vote in the first round. So how did the electoral reform allow this thing to happen, this rising party? And then for Rossana, I just wonder what you think about Frente Amplio. Is it an example of the repoliticizing of inequalities? Is it good for the discourse in Chile? You can answer briefly, but I'm just very curious. So how did it happen, given the electoral reforms? And what do you think of it?
Great. I saw a hand up over here as well. Yes, would you say it? Yeah, give them the blue hoodie. Say who you are, please.
Yes. Hi, I'm Felipe Felix. I'm a first year from Panama and Uruguay. And my question is for David. So you were saying it's kind of similar in terms of what part of your talk is targeting. You were saying that poverty and ethnic minority were common characteristics of districts that lost power in the 2015 reform. I'm curious as to whether there were also ideological preferences that were common among those groups.
And we can take a third question if there is one, otherwise we'll let them. Jessa Lana Weaver, the director of CLACS at Brown University. Jessa?
Sure. I'm just curious, what do the pundits in Chile think is the problem? First of all, is this a problem in current media? Do people talk about this as the problem, the decrease of enthusiasm about democracy? And then what do they think I believe you have persuaded me. I believe your take on it. But what do the people on the news say is wrong with Chile right now? Does it align with what you're saying, or do they have some other theory about what's wrong?
Okay. You guys want to take?
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. They are tough questions. Regarding the Frente Amplio, I think they are trying to speak for the poor. It doesn't mean that they are poor, or they are truly represent these sectors, this strata of society. Most of the leaders of this new coalition called Frente Amplio, they are former university leaders of the revolts that Rossana showed, these huge demonstrations. And some of them, most of them, somehow they were militants of the Concertación before, right? In one way or another. Georgia Jackson, Boric, all these guys. And some of them are from the Communist Party as well, sure. So I think they try to offer a liberal, fresh perspective to Chilean politics. And how it come to be? Well, this new electoral system definitely it's more open to the inclusion of third forces than was before, the system that we have before, and that's it was easier to penetrate the system. What I'm saying is not that it's closer or harder to penetrate the system, but it's less proportional. I mean, the noise between the translation of votes to seats makes more noise than the system that we had before. I'm not saying if I have to choose either one, probably I choose this one, but I'm saying that we lost an opportunity of making a better reform than this one. And this was the reform that Chileans sought to make, and they succeed to make, because it resembles pretty much the electoral system that Chile had before 1973, with all the problems that we had at that time too. So Bea Sanchez, yeah, she arose as she's a powerful, a brilliant woman with extremely articulated. She had a lot of years in her career in the news, and she has a fantastic voice, and she's extremely articulated. So she gathered this sensation of frustration that Chileans had during the last administration of Bachelet. And that's the reason why she got 22%, which is a huge amount of votes. So now, the losers of this game, this was a statistical exercise. One of the problems that I didn't mention of the previous electoral system was the relative power that some districts had in relation to their population. So this new electoral system tried to fix that, but that was to the price of these particular groups of districts in the center down of Araucanía region in Chile, right? Which are mostly Mapuche districts, which are also poor. It is not that easy, the combination of poverty, ethnic lines, and ideological lines. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's quite ambiguous. I mean, sometimes the left one, sometimes the right, but if I have to choose, my intuition says that they were a little bit more to the right than to the left. But we have to see the statistics. I don't remember exactly in which election. There was some alternation during these 7 elections that we had. And in terms of pundits, well, that's tough. We have everything. Chile has everything. I would say that in the academic world, most of our colleagues would agree basically with what we said. No?
Okay.
Okay. No. It's gonna be a huge. It's gonna be a huge discussion. No. Okay. But I think that people are somehow happy that the whole architecture, the old architecture, changed, and we renovated some facades of the whole building, institutional building. Many people are frustrated. I would say that there is, and I can, at least in political science, most of political scientists would agree with mandatory vote to be reinstalled again. I would say that, yeah, something like that. Her face says a lot, so I let her to answer that question more
So
in depth.
I will start with the last part. No, what I think there are, like, how can I say this elegantly? But there are, I don't, okay, let me rephrase.
Rephrase.
It, yeah. You have some independent scholars that are not attached to political parties, that have no relationship, they don't advise specific politicians. And then you have some scholars that are quite close to specific candidates or parties, okay? This is not always entirely clear. So what we call operadores políticos, political operators, if that's a word in English, sometimes there is a public discourse regarding what is good for Chile that I frankly think is good for certain candidates or certain agendas. So, for example, what we're thinking about something specific. Many scholars are in favor of mandatory vote for the reasons that David said, but some are against. And publicly, they argue several technical reasons why they are against. But I think there is also a lot of fear regarding the half of Chileans that do not vote. 50% of the population doesn't vote. We don't know anything about non-voters. I don't want to say we don't know anything. We know a lot about voters, but then there is this other 50%. Who are they? What do they want? What are their aspirations? Why are they angry? We know much less about them. So we did an exercise some time ago. A colleague of mine, Claudio Fuentes, did interviews with non-voters. It's all online. It's called La Otra Mitad. I think anthropologists like you have a feast there. You know, there is a lot of qualitative work to do. You know, to do observation, to do ethnographic work, for example, to understand these people who are angry and are not voting. So some things we know, but some others we don't. And it was a very interesting exercise, this La Otra Mitad, the other half, with these interviews to gather who they are. So I think that some scholars who are not in favor of mandatory vote are really afraid that if all these guys go to the polls, we will have, I don't know what, you know. And I think it's a reasonable fear if you want the incumbents to maintain their positions, you know. So what I want to say is that in general, I think there is we share a diagnosis, but not necessarily we share solutions. I don't know if I told you this, but I was at an activity commenting some presentations, and someone said, well, what can we done about the situation in Chile? And one said, well, perhaps all scholars, perhaps we should think about direct democratic devices, no, the topics you work. And there was this scholar, very prominent scholar, he was so angry, like, this is the end.
Of course.
And he started to talk about, I don't know, a mixture of Venezuela and a revolution, and I don't know how many things he said. And I remember I was commenting, I was not presenting, and I asked, you know, and do you pity the Swiss? Like, because if I think about direct democracy, I think about the Swiss, and I'm not like poor Swiss people, you know, with direct democracy. But they really think that giving power to the people has all these risks. So I think there is a combination of fearfulness, the sensation that we have to do something about this, but the ones deciding, the incumbents, will lose if there are some adjustments. Now, the paradoxical thing is that this reform allowed Frente Amplio to get in. And I think, yes, Frente Amplio is the result of a process of politicization of inequalities. The problem is that because of the current institutional design, Frente Amplio can get there, but won't be able to do everything this conglomerate wants without the votes of the opposition. So the risk about this is going back to modernization theories of the 1960s, the revolution of growing expectations that some sociologists used to say, you know, like you have people wanting changes, you have some political actors elected to Congress, new figures, but they will need to go through the same institutions that make things difficult. So how this politicization of inequality translates into structural changes of any sort is still something we don't know.
Great, I know there's at least one more question, two more. Okay, so let's take another round. We have till 1:30 technically, okay. Andrew Schrank, Professor of Sociology and International Studies here at Brown.
Thank you. First I'm going to be acknowledged, I'm going to be rude because I have to run out right after this, but I'm wondering if there's data on support for autocracy over time. And I ask because you can be dissatisfied with democracy and think the solution is more democracy and not autocracy. And it doesn't necessarily, I don't necessarily assume that because people are pissed off with functioning of Chilean democracy over the past 20 years, that they want an autocratic solution like Bolsonaro or maybe Trump. It might be that they want the type of democracy you would favor.
Right. Yeah.
And yes, over here, Jim, you are, please.
I'm Adam Myers. So I had a question, well, I had two questions for Professor Altman. I wanted to go back to this issue of the apportionment of seats in the Congress.
Yeah.
Because if I heard you correctly, what you said is that the previous electoral system was basically malapportioned.
Yes.
In favor of like those heavily Mapuche areas, south of Santiago. So if that's the case, then the regression that you showed, that poor Mapuche areas kind of experienced a decline in representation after the new electoral reform, that's entirely a result of the fact that this new system is more equally apportioned across the area. So isn't that a good thing? Doesn't that suggest that where Chile is moving more toward each citizen having an equally weighted vote no matter where they live? So I guess what's the problem with that? Yeah. And then for Professor Castiglioni, I wanted to ask, I was intrigued by, you were talking about the importance of informal institutions and like slowing down democratic effectiveness in Chile, and I was wondering what those institutions were. And usually when democracies are under stress, those institutions are the first ones to go, right? Because those are the easiest ones to change. So I was wondering if you're seeing evidence of that.
Any other questions people want to put on the table? Okay, yeah.
Is it okay?
Sure.
Like a very general question. One of you, I can't remember which, referred to a time in Chilean history, or at least a memory of the Chileans, the self-memory of the Chileans, where there was good feeling and goodwill across the parties. Is there a term for that period? Is that convivencia?
Convivencia? I mean, convivencia could mean that, but
did I hear you say that, I've understood that Chilean politics is more polarized now, despite some of the horrors in the history, that there was a time when people would try to listen to the other side.
Democracia de los acuerdos.
Yes.
That, okay.
Okay, so that's the name, okay.
Sí.
And so I'm just wondering if you could say a bit about what that is, and especially how does that relate to another Spanish word I can't remember, for what's the word for backhoe or bucket loader? Retroexcavadora?
La retroexcavadora.
It's the word the minister used.
Retroexcavadora.
But under Bachelet, there was a
Yes.
So is the rise of retroexcavadora the end of convivencia, or what? How does that?
Okay.
That was a badly formed question. I'm trying to figure out, is there more polarization now? What's the cause of the polarization? Is there a longing for a more collegial politics?
Next time, we're gonna insist that you pose your question in Spanish.
Well, in terms of the autocracy, Andrew's question, I will leave to you, Rossana, because you are more in the team working with these perceptions and public opinion and white people. But I would like to mention that if probably no, you didn't pay attention, but during this last week and a half, we have a bunch of extremely important political leaders of some political parties going to Brazil just to kiss Bolsonaro. Literally to kiss Bolsonaro and all what he represents. So the president of the UDI, Jacqueline Van Berger, and Moreira, who else was it?
No, we're talking about the
And there was
president of the...
No, the president of the UDI, one of the largest political parties in Chile, went to Rio just to kiss Bolsonaro. And she appeared in the front page of all newspapers in Chile, and then about 32 or 33 Congress members of Renovación Nacional signed a letter, an open letter, supporting Bolsonaro, with all what it means and all the connotation that it has. So I wouldn't say that, I think the majority of Chilean citizens still support democracy, more drastic, more light, whatever. I'm not saying that they are autocrats, fans, but there are some important groups there which are represented in Congress. In terms of malapportionment, I 100% agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. What I wanted to stress is that it was a huge tension in Chile, because we know that we have an important ethnic minority which is weaker than the majority, and we lost an opportunity to make some arrangement, institutional arrangement, to increase or to improve the apportionment of the system in general, but at the same time not to take the little quota of power that they have. That's why during this Benninger Commission, I was strongly advocating for some reform going through the New Zealand lines of mixed member proportional representation, which allows you to make some quotas for natives or ethnic minorities or gender minorities or whatever you want to stress. In New Zealand, they have reserved seats for Maori people. And the proportion of Maori people are basically extremely similar to the proportion of Mapuche people that we have. It was absolutely disregarded. They say that if we start to give, and that was a commission made up by 10 aparatniks of the Concertación and 3 academicians. We were about 13 people there. That was considered the end of democracy. Even in that circle, I was absolutely surprised, and they accused, as I mentioned, they accused me that I'm not a Democrat because I'm advocating for a closed list. I was, what? It was 2006. I was only 3 years in Chile then, so I couldn't understand what was going on. But what I'm saying is not, and I agree with you, we have a huge tension there, whether we apportion seats more coherently with the votes and the number of votes, but we have a minority, which is one of the major problems that we have in social problems that we have in Chile that we are not addressing, and we don't care. So the system and the reform, and I think the Bachelet administration she gave up too easy to the corporations. And this government didn't really took distance or the necessary time or care to draft a reform paying more attention to these dimensions that they were obviously there. They just wanted to be the famous one to enter in history. Hey, we were the ones making history. Yeah. I don't know how many, in a few years, how we're gonna see that reform, but that, again, I agree with you 100% in this tension, normative tension between representation and minorities and rights and obligations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm going to mix the two last questions to answer because they basically point to informal institutions, you know, to the way things that were done. One of the most important informal institutions, and that goes only to you, is quoteo, you know, a sort of informal quota system to distribute important posts. That there is no reason why incumbents are going to change or share more power with others. If you are there, if you have the, how do you say, el sartén por el mango, you know, and y el mango también, as Maria Elena Walsh used to say, if you really control power, why are you going to share it with an outsider or someone who is not there? So that, I think, won't change. But there is another institution that probably will change, and that's Democracia de los Acuerdos. Democracia de los Acuerdos, and if you are interested in this, Peter Ciabelis has worked with this a lot, and he knows much more than I do about this. Refer to the fact that Chile's presidents and authorities in general, but presidents in particular, were, and that goes to you too, were not willing generally to present reform projects when they knew they didn't have the support in Congress. So they refrained to presenting things that might create conflict with the opposition. And I remember vividly the first time the Concertación lost the election to Piñera. I was riding in my car, and they were interviewing Lagos Weber, the son of President Lagos. So the journalist, a very old, with a lot of experience journalist, was saying, well, why do you think you lose the election? And he was saying, well, the right did this, and the opposition did that, and we were not able to fight, and they this and that and that. And the journalists say, okay, let's be clear. Didn't you do anything wrong? Do you regret something? It's all the other guys? And he says, yes, I regret something. I regret not to fight when I knew I was going to lose. And that was an epiphany for me. Because in that sentence, it was so much. It was the fact that Democracia de los Acuerdos basically turned the Concertación in a sort of avoiding getting into areas that were creating conflict. But if you have most of the population saying, we need, I don't know, to pass these and these and these reforms, these areas are critical for us, and you don't have an answer from the government, this is going to have a price. And I think one of the problems, and that goes to what Jess was saying before, is one of the problems with the political elite is that it became incredibly detached from societal changes. So, I mean, I could tell you so many stories that you couldn't believe me. Like talking to people, normal people, clever people, than would say. I remember having this conversation with a senator, was a president of an important party, when they passed the legislation of divorce, for God's sake, divorce. And he said, he was so proud, and he said, well, what do you think about my law? And I said, like, do you want it the Chilean way or the Uruguayan way? He said, both. Well, the Chilean way, well, it's good, but I think you should have changed some things, whatever. The Uruguayan way, it sucks. And he said, why? Why do you say that? And I said, well, you know, the problem is that you are obligated to be separated for several years before being formally divorced. So why don't you impose servicio sexual obligatorio? You know, sexual social service, mandatory. Oh, that would be crazy. Well, that's the point. You could not say to people, you have to have sex for so many years before you get divorced, because it's stupid. You cannot say to people, you have to live together for so many years until you think it's good to get a divorce. So I don't know. What I'm saying with this example is a stupid example, but the point is that you have an elite that is increasingly detached from societal change and what people believe. And then the other question. Well, I haven't worked directly. What I showed, the data shows you that support for democracy is relatively stable. This is the good news. The other good news, I haven't worked with that, but I have two colleagues, Carlos Melendez and Cristóbal Rovira, who did such a funny job. They is so good. I really like what they are doing. They were gathering information on negative identities, the anti-establishment guys, you know. So these are the ones that are not willing to vote for anyone. You know, the concertación sucks, the right wing sucks, everything sucks. Los que se vayan todos, okay? Let's remove all of them. So this in Peru, for example, which you know Peru is a very complex political system, this is around 35% according to Carlos Melendez. They did the same exercise in Chile, and what they have is that this is around 13%. So the ones who want to burn it all still are a minority. And let's pray, if you do pray, if not, you know, a candle or good wishes for us, that this will remain that. Because if this figure changes, I think we are in deep trouble. So that was
Yeah, I just wanted to add
optimistic.
Yeah, no, but I just wanted to add to this explanation that one of the problems that the institutional architecture of Chile had, it was that everything was so clear and so automatic, and you knew more or less how many legislators you're going to obtain and everything, that it produced some sort of detachment from political parties to the citizenry. So they didn't need to exercise. So everything was straightforward. And that what pissed off many people in Chile, because political elites were absolutely detached from what was going on the ground. You know, of the stresses and the problems of citizens. There were no connections whatsoever. So there was this incredible separation, and that they were extremely happy with the divorce law, when most of Chileans were extremely on behalf of divorce, of course. The same happened with abortion, that just now was approved last year, for the 3 causes that in Uruguay we had for 150 years already. I mean, there are different universes, but they were so relaxed that everything was fine, that in that regard, Bachelet administration really moved the fence few steps forwards. And from that perspective, it was extremely welcome. But that is to say that the reforms were great? Well, I don't know if I'm so happy that to have abortion only for these 3 causes. Let us decide, or whether this divorce law or any other aspect of social concern. So that was what I want to say.
One last thing, aren't elites always out of touch by definition?
No.
With the masses?
No.
I'm remembering we had some well-known musicians here at the Watson Institute last year. People remember the rock band Living Colour. Half of the rock band Living Colour was here, and they shared their biographies and so forth. And we did a little interview with one of the musicians, and Vernon Reed is his name. And Vernon said, you know, we need a better class of rich people. In the U.S., he was thinking about the United States. So what makes the Chilean elite more out of touch than others, if that's what you're saying?
Well, I say that I think that the electoral system helped a lot, because it provides such amount of certainty that they didn't need to even to exercise, to go to the field to gather votes almost. I mean, everything was ensured. You have this amount of votes here, you have this amount of votes here, so in this district we're going to elect A and B, and in this one both are going to belong to this coalition, and this one both going to belong to the other coalition. When you have a more fluid electoral system that allows for people to change easily, and these changes to be reflected in the how the composition of the chambers are done, that's one step. And then, if you have some channels, and that I know that I'm moving the conversation to a completely different new dimension, but if you have channels for citizens to demand changes from political elites, I'm talking about political elites, no rich, no economic elites, but political elites, they're gonna be like popular initiatives. If you don't do this, or if you approve this law, be aware we're gonna try to derogate this law straight by popular vote. So you're gonna be a little bit more careful with my opinion before you approve that law, or if you don't listen to what my demands are. So, institutionally speaking, let's say elites, they try to detach from society because probably it's the inertia. But there are institutional features that help to tie them with society somehow. 100%? Probably not, but a little bit, yeah.
I have a different take on that. I agree with you though, but I don't know. The older I'm getting, the less political scientistic I'm getting. So I read some of my friends who come from sociology and political sociology who are working in this, and they are doing, Alfredo, for example, Alfredo Joñan, is doing a very interesting job studying elites. And something that he shows that is very interesting is that the Chilean elite, the political and economic elite, but he studied mainly the political elite, they come from a few schools, they go to 1 or 2 universities, they go in the summer to the same seasides or resorts, they go to the same clubs.
They married each other.
And then I was shocked when he did the presentation for a small group. He was talking about marital strategies of the elite. And I said, like, you know what, you're getting into a lot of trouble. Don't say that because it makes like an intention of marrying some. Well, but these are, I mean.
Those are facts.
Those are facts. And he was showing that they marry among themselves. I'm not sure, I mean, I think that the US, because it's so large, for example, you wouldn't have that because you have several elites. I don't know if the guys in LA are the same in New York City or, I don't know. I don't know if they are, there might be. I haven't read a reproduction of the elites in the US.
It's that Brown and Harvard are totally different.
But I don't know. But my sensation is that in some cases, for example, thinking of the Uruguayan case, that is the case I know the most, economic elites and political elites were separated.
Yeah.
Historically. They were not the same, necessarily. So, and there is still some distance between, among themselves, which I think is relatively healthy for the political system, you know. So I don't know. That's my take on that.
Very good. A lot of wisdom. Any other comments or questions? We have time. Yeah, Dakota. Say who you are and.
Hi, Dakota. Senior here studying international relations. I spent some time in Chile this past summer studying issues of democratic consolidation. So I was just wondering, we talked about how this binomial system kind of led to certainty and a lack of competition and maybe reduced voter participation. And also how these social changes got pushed back and weren't put through for a few years. I guess I was wondering, do you two think this was a necessary component of that process of democratic consolidation, or would you have liked to have seen these reforms moved up time-wise?
Wow, that's a tough question. I would say, well, it depends how you, from which perspective you see that. There are other experiences of transition or successful transitions, that, like Uruguay, that Uruguay basically, the new system is basically the same system that we had before 1973. So it still was one of the most proportional countries on earth. You know, everything was basically the same. So to change the electoral game was not a requisite for the consensus toward the transition to democracy, and actually Uruguayan transition as Chilean, it's quite regarded as one of the successful stories in South America, right? So I don't see that we needed that to move forward to democracy. It was the difference, and maybe Rossana can explain that a little bit better, is that the dictatorship government in Chile was much more successful than the Uruguayan one. So they had much more leverage to negotiate certain conditions for transition. Remember that the transition was in 1990. Chile was the last one. I mean, Argentina 1983, Uruguay 85, Chile, Brazil 85, countries even before that. So there was the last autocratic dot in South American continent, right? But given that Pinochet was in such a position to demand something, otherwise I don't give up the power, I don't know how much would he had lasted without this agreement from the opposition parties. So I don't know, it depends. You have successful stories from making these concessions to the autocratic regime, and you have successful stories that didn't do these concessions to autocratic regimes. That's my,
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, some colleagues of us would say, I'm not saying this is like a disclaimer, my opinion doesn't necessarily, but some scholars say that the electoral system brought stability to Chile
That's for sure.
the years after transition, and that's why some very clever people we know defended the binomial system. Some political science that we know and we like in theory were very strongly against, and they have good arguments, you know, why. But, you know, I have the sensation that all of us who were foreigners in Chile thought it smelled bad. There was something wrong, not only in normative terms, but we weren't sure, because the public opinion polls were showing noises 10, 15 years ago, where you saw trust was going down and whatever. So we tended to read this as a problematic. I remember Juan Pablo also, it's not only the two of us, but several scholars who were not Chilean, but Chileans thought it was because Chile had this history of polarization, and you have to understand Chileans are really scared
Of conflict.
and polarization. Some people really never got over it, you know. So
Just a little anecdote. Once we were having dinner with the kids, and I don't know if the kids were there already. As soon as we arrived, no, they were not there. So we were discussing on, I don't know, a football game or something like
yeah.
that. You remember? And was, no, Rossana, no, I mean, no, look, this team, no, you play horrible, no, you play. And people around us start to look at us. They thought that we were having fighting.
but we were discussing the Uruguayan way, which is like the Italian way.
And-
You know, you move your hands and you raise
And
your
someone
voice.
asked, is everything okay? Yeah, we are just discussing. Discussing? Even the word discussing.
Yeah.
In Chilean Spanish, it has a negative connotation. Why making a discussion in Uruguay is not necessarily a negative. It could be.
And
It's
why-
neutral. You're exchanging strong ideas, but it's not negative necessarily.
That's why my comment, do you want me to say the Chilean way or the Uruguayan way? Because
But at the same
Chileans
time,
are much more polite too.
Chileans are much more polite, much more conservative. They are afraid of conflict, but they're extremely pragmatic as well. And that's one of the crazy things of this country. It's extremely pragmatic country as well. Just to give, we were talking about the political science environment in Chile. More than half of it's from people that they are not Chileans. At the Católica, we are 2/3 of the faculty. We are from overseas. At the Diego Portales, about half of the faculty is from overseas. So they are pragmatic at the same
They are
time.
pragmatic.
They are it's a fantastic
willing,
combination of.
As they say, they are willing to swallow the frog, you know, tragarse el sapo. If they don't like it, but it's good, they will buy it anyway. So.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, this was really wonderful. A lot of wisdom and just delightful to have both of you here. Please join me in thanking Rossana and
you.
David for such a lively conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.